Seven on Sunday's podcast is intended for mature audiences. Episodes discuss sensitive and fraught topics that many teens and 20-somethings face, but may be triggering. The content may not be suitable for all audience members. Please take caution when listening.
People will always say to me, you chose the industry, you chose it. And I say, no, I decided to enter the industry because I had no choice. I have met actually very few women who have not at some point in their life sexually compromised themselves for their livelihood. Once you are deeply, deeply in the pit of it, as I call it, the trenches there of the commercial sex industry, it's very hard to get out because that is where the biggest financial reward is. We literally lay on our backs on a bed as strange man after strange man after strange man takes his turn with us. And if that, doesn't make you think of just how much it turns us into what my friend calls mince meat, in my opinion, you don't have empathy, you don't have a soul.
Hello, listeners. Glad you can join me today. I'm your host, Stephanie Boye, sex educator, and my co-host, Dr. Shez Levy, is a licensed marriage and family therapist, but she is off today. What I'm about to share with you is an interview I did with Andrea Heinz. She is a Canadian author of the book When Men Buy Sex, Who Really Pays? They are the Canadian stories of exploitation, survival, and advocacy. Her book was published last year by Frisian Press. Andrea is an advocate for the Nordic model for prostitution, a speaker, and a former sex worker. If you are not familiar with the Nordic model, it offers solutions and a legal approach to prostitution that elevates the status of women and others in prostitution while targeting those who harm persons in prostitutions, the buyers and third-party profiteers. Thus, the Nordic model targets the demand as a means to abolishing prostitution. I became aware of Andrea a few years ago after reading an essay that she wrote, and it really blew me away. I will put a link to it in the show notes. It's extremely powerful, and I highly recommend you take time to read it. Here is how it begins. Time heals all wounds. Time does little for scars. They permanently stick to you as a vivid reminder of your vulnerability and the time you faced some sort of harm. I carry over 4,300 emotional scars with me every day from each man I sold my body to during the 7 years of prostitution. When I was finally emancipated from sexual exploitation, I spent over a quarter of my life as an escort, brothel worker, and later a madam. I'm not the extreme story you hear about where a woman is abducted, transported to a random location, beaten, and then trafficked into the sex trade. I am the woman you would walk down the street next to and envisage was probably a college student or someone working a square job. The fake smile I put on each morning will never alert you to who and what I really was, or that my real world was filled with sadness, abuse, and loneliness. I read this essay so many times, read it to my husband, I cried reading it, and talking to its author, Andrea Heinz, was profoundly important to me. And I think it should be for anyone who has fallen prey to the ideas that sex work is in any way glamorous, empowering, or agentic. And I use the term agentic, which speaks to sexual agency. And if you don't know that term, it means individuals' ability to make informed decisions about their sexual experiences. So, for example, you decide you want to have sex with somebody only if they use a condom. The second that they take off a condom and stealth you, you are not agentic in that. They have taken away your agency. And sex workers are not empowered or agentic, as you will hear from Andrea. Their boundaries are not respected. They cannot communicate their needs, even if that need is to use protection. Most times, they don't have autonomy to choose what they want to happen in a commercial sex act. And I mean that because they may initially consent to something during the commercial negotiation of what they're going to do, but Johns will often abuse their power and ignore the boundaries of people in sex work. And I say that because I have talked to many and read much about women who have left prostitution. And I think the statistics are somewhere around 90+% have experienced sexual assault while doing sex work. And that's not just women, that's women, men, trans individuals. So, what strikes me in this conversation is how Andrea is so clear about what drove her to sex work. Beyond her need for money, which made her vulnerable, was how clear she was that the exposure to and glamorization of this hyper-sexualized porn culture kind of groomed her into thinking that sex work was no big deal or even empowering. So, whether you are a person listening to this considering stripping, sugaring, becoming an OnlyFans content creator, or a porn actress, or maybe you have a friend who is doing one of those things, I think it's really important to hear the words of Andrea's friend, who is the founder of CEASE. It's a Canadian nonprofit. It's an acronym for the Center to End All Sexual Exploitation. She has some really profound insight about sex work. Let this sink in. She says, there are many pathways in and so few pathways out. Certainly, there are many more sex workers than the ones I have spoken to, but I've spoken to many, and that rings very true. Women who have been in the trade and then can't get work. They have a big empty spot in their resume, and they kind of stay in that life for a long time. And in that life, they have to present as if they're enjoying it. They have to, nobody wants to have sex with a prostitute who hates her job. So enjoying it, acting as though it is empowering, is part of the facade that is put up. Anyway, the other thing that really strikes me from this conversation with Andrea is when she talks about women who choose to do sex work. And she points out that there is a big difference between choosing sex work and deciding to do sex work. And I love this. She said, for many, it is not a choice between two good options, but a decision to do it because they have no other choice. That is truth. So we will jump into my discussion with Andrea, and I hope that it is as enlightening and informative to you as it was for me. Welcome to the show, Andrea Heinz.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here and to be joining you. The work I'm presently doing is pretty much exactly what you said, just trying to raise awareness about commercial sexual exploitation and the harm that comes with sex work ideology, which we're seeing infiltrating mainstream society very, very much. So it's really a conversation that doesn't occur too much. We're seeing a really, really big spotlight being shone on human trafficking for the purposes of commercial sexual exploitation. But I think a lot of the times the dots aren't really being connected, where we're bringing it back to understanding that prostitution is a very similar activity in which women are not operating with a lot of agency and choice. So I think that there's a lot of blurred lines in that. And I really know that there's a limited number of us that are privileged enough to be able to speak out safely on this issue. And fortunately, I'm one of those people. So I just think it's really important to do that. And as a result, I'm coming out with a book that I'm co authoring alongside the mother of one of Canada's murdered women. Her name is Kathy King, and our book is called When Men Buy Sex, Who Really Pays? And so we're looking to have that out probably come April or May is our goal. I'm also executive producer of an 8-part docuseries titled Labeled, which I'm doing in conjunction with a local film production company in my city, Guerrilla Motion Pictures. And Labeled really kind of pulls apart the issue, but also follows my journey to have the United States of America lift my travel ban that I received in 2010 when I was still active in the sex trade. So just doing some of those things and also being a mom of 3 and trying to finish a degree. It's tough some days, but very, very fulfilling as well.
I think what you just said kind of speaks to one of the problems with prostitution, the way that it is right now, and the reason why some people think like legalization is a good thing. But the idea is, and I've seen a lot on your Twitter account about how we are arresting the women who've been prostituted and not arresting the Johns. So maybe you can just say, like, what is your position on legalization or how law should treat the sex worker versus the sex buyer?
Well, I think something very important to understand is something that Rachel Moran, Irish survivor, has said. And she said, you can't have equality or look at the sex trade as operating with equality between buyer and seller when they have not entered the industry with equality as the foundation for both of them. And so we do know that men who buy sex particularly are usually, I shouldn't say particularly, but oftentimes are older, wealthier, have stable jobs, have families, are, people who have integrated into society and are part of the system. Whereas a lot of people who are selling sex, men and women, but mostly women, are socioeconomically marginalized. They're struggling to find employment. They are single mothers. They are oftentimes very young, sometimes even minors who end up getting stuck in that life. So it's really a very big power dynamic at play. And so when you look at it in that regard, it's very hard to think that both are responsible for what we're seeing happening and the deterioration of society and our collectivism. In that sense, I think it's very important to not criminalize women. I really don't know of anybody except for angry people who believe that criminalizing women is appropriate. Even those who are very, very strong proponents of sex work ideology and the full decriminalization of the sex trade do not support any type of criminalization against women. So that is the one positive thing that we all come together on, is that it's very rare to see anyone believe in that approach. Where we differ on it is that some people support decriminalizing the entire industry, which includes men who want to use money in a coercive manner to pay for sex and acquire sex with women. And there will be basically two camps with that, which is the full decriminalization camp who supports that, and then those that I align with who are Nordic model or equality model supporters. And we're the people who believe that there is reason and justice in arresting men and charging them for sexually exploiting women and using their resources to do that, and also supporting women and their exit strategies and trying to recognize the sex industry as a form of violence against women. So I'm a very, very strong supporter of the latter model, and I'm encouraged that it's starting to take footing throughout the world. And I think that we need to see some more of that growth.
There's a lot to dig into with what you just said.
I think it really always just circles back to how you view using money or resources in a coercive manner to obtain sex. Some people will say it's work. Anything that we do, any type of labor activity that we do that we are compensated for is work. And therefore, we see that very popular mantra, sex work is work. And it's very catchy and very palatable and appealing to people. But I think whenever you really look at the nature of consent and what creates the definition of consent, it doesn't often work to then boat it with someone being under duress or someone being marginalized. And I think in a perfect world, if people were saying sex work is work and they wanted to support it, then that might possibly be just if we didn't see that differentiation between buyer and seller that we see so rampantly. So until women have a full equality in society, we really can't say that things that we're doing sexually for money with people that we typically are not sexually attracted to is really us acting in full agency. There's a lot of arguments for it, and it is a lot to pull apart. Definitely, I do respect those that hold an ulterior position, but I think, and I should say, I did once hold that position myself. I was a very, very strong supporter of full decrim, but once I really started to see it firsthand and then live it firsthand for 7 years, and struggle with dissociation and all the trauma that comes with unwanted sexual contact with strangers, it really shaped my mind in a completely different way.
I think maybe it would be helpful if we went back and we talked about who is the sex worker, because that really gives you an insight to the vulnerability of a person who would make that choice, if it is in fact a choice, because we'll get into later. I find it very hard to believe that most, I'm just going to say 99% of women and men who are in sex work, I really believe that it's a huge number that are trafficked into what they're doing. But let's just maybe, if we could, Andrea, step back and talk about your story and how that is or is not similar to a lot of the women that you've seen in the sex industry, so that people can understand. I think there's a lot of myths that we want to maybe jump into later, but that idea that this is voluntary, that this is something you want, that you love sex, that you're making great money, all of that kind of stuff. Let's start with your story and then we'll kind of break down those myths.
Well, my experience growing up was a wonderful family. It really was. My parents are still together. They've been together for, oh my gosh, more than 4 decades now. I didn't deal with any familial abuse in any capacity. So for me, it was a lot again of going back to that culture of media, particularly music, and also exposure to being a child at a daycare and having a young boy have me touch his penis at nap time and speak graphically to me. And so just early exposure, really. And when that happened, just kind of making me hyper aware of sexuality as well. And then going into the 90s, with the crop tops and things like that, just trying to embody that because that was mainstream culture. There's a lot of women that don't end up in the sex trade. But what I have learned is that a lot of women, even if they don't go all in, so to speak, like I did, and become licensed and operate within a regulated system selling sex, I have met actually very few women who have not at some point in their life sexually compromised themselves for their livelihood. So when we hear people saying again, not all women sell sex, that's because also not all women have the opportunity to speak on that without some type of repercussion. So I think maybe that's something that comes with the work that I do and being public about it, is that women feel comfortable to tell me their stories. And so a lot of people that know women that I know who have sold sex have no clue that they have done that in an informal environment or in an informal manner. It's much more rampant than we think it is. It's happening all over.
Yeah.
And I truly believe that men in their nature are good and that they don't intend to hurt women. Of course, there's always outliers to that and everything, but I am a supporter in the rehabilitation of men and who buy sex and support them wholeheartedly. And I believe that they can be rehabilitated as well. So that's very important to remember, is that I think if we were to say to these men, I don't like having sex with you and it causes me trauma, but I need money for groceries, I like to believe that most men would rethink their choices. So, yeah, whenever we talk about who is the typical sex seller, there's really no single story. But what I have learned is that every single seller has a story. So really it also kind of depends on where you're sourcing the information when you're studying this population. So if you are to go to the streets into a inner city neighborhood and speak with, for example, here in Edmonton, an Indigenous young woman who their parents are a product of the 60s scoop and the residential school system, you would hear a much different story of quote unquote agency than you would if you speak to someone like me, who is a Caucasian woman who entered the industry at 22 because of debt. There is a very strong class divide and a class system that exists in the industry. And so a lot of times we don't hear from the most marginalized people. We hear this very sensationalized and romanticized version of involvement that comes from the sex work as work groups and the sex workers as they call themselves. So that's something I think people forget, is that we hear what's nice. We don't often hear the really, really bad truth unless we're shifting into talking about human trafficking. But my story, it's pretty common actually, and at least for the women that I have interacted with and known, and that's just being a young woman who really struggled with employment and not having a good skill set to fall back on, having debt, no financial literacy, having low self-esteem from dating the wrong men who were financially and emotionally and physically abusive, men who got caught up in the drug trade. So, damaged people in their own right at that time. Really, I always say the number one thing though that really, really led me into the sex trade as much as the debt was the hyper-sexualized culture and seeing that everywhere, the mantra, the sex work is work, this is empowering, girl bossing it, all these things. So I see the story time and time and time again.
I think you highlighted something really interesting to me and something that I was going to ask you about, but it's kind of like coming together in this question or what you just discussed, is that I think the idea, and maybe this is like an old myth, the idea is that somebody who's in sex work is damaged, has been through trauma, all of that kind of stuff. I will say there have been people, I've spoken to a lot of girls who are in pornography, and most of them tell me that when they step away, they see that most of those girls have some pretty serious psychological damage. I'm sure it got exacerbated while they were in pornography, but that it started before then. So maybe that's not the norm, but it speaks to one question I was going to ask you about, that our culture has normalized sex work. And I think that that is something else I heard. Like maybe there's like small trauma with some of the girls I've spoken to, but that they also think, again, they go buy into the it's glamorous, it's sex is empowering, all of these kinds of like lies that once you get in there, you realize there's nothing empowering about this. There is nothing glamorous about this. This is actually freaking dangerous. And it's going to lead to very extremely negative outcomes once you get out. But you're too naive when you get in. You get in naive and you realize once you're in. And then there's a stigma attached to those people who do that work. So do you see, like, would you agree with that, Andrea, that like a lot of today, and maybe you're younger than me, so maybe it's just like since the 2000s that that has been glamorized in such a way that, and it's so normalized because so many people watch pornography and there's amateur porn, and so it's like this idea that sex work is something everybody does. Sugaring is a way to make money to pay for your college bills. Maybe it's camming or escorting, or being an OnlyFans creator, that's sort of like benign, but really it's a little bit more slippery slope than that. Would you say that's true? I know I gave
Absolutely.
you a
One,
lot there. I gave you a
yeah.
lot.
No, you basically said it all right there. And that's exactly it, is that with both buyers and sellers, it's a slippery slope. You're dabbling your toes a little bit because as much as it's interesting, as much as it's all mainstream and in your face, it's also still very secretive and stigmatized and shamed. So it has this weird duality to it
Mhm.
where people will see it happening, but it's always objective, right? It's not happening to them. And so they observe it. And because the narrative is very much leaning towards that empowerment
Positive.
and positive, sex positive, distorted sex positive mindset, then yeah, it leads a lot of people into thinking, well, it's not that bad, right? And look at the success that everyone else is having. And that was certainly what happened to me, was seeing that being the portrayal of female empowerment and female success, and how we were going to get ahead and make our mark in the world is by using our bodies. And so, I don't think too many people think that they will end up fully having, sexual intercourse in private spaces with sex buyers when they're first considering things like OnlyFans or selling, feet pictures or soiled underwear or all those types of things, or maybe sugaring, just seeing one guy here and there. But you get comfortable doing it. And I shouldn't say that everyone ends up going into the full service, as we call it, area, but it's more common than not. And I think that you do a little and you get a little bit more brave, and there's more money to be made in that one-on-one intercourse activity than there is, being on OnlyFans, unless you are a celebrity, essentially. So yeah, whenever you're doing it and nothing seemingly bad is happening to you and you're being financially rewarded, all that you're thinking is, well, how can I make more money? Right? We all want to climb that corporate ladder and get ahead. So the next logical thing to do is just to expand your business, as you would call it. But we see that too with buyers, right? A lot of times it will be, they start off cam chatting, and then they start going to strip club venues and talking to women there. And then, that can be a doorway for them to then becoming full sex buyers. And once you are deeply, deeply in the pit of it, as I call it, the trenches there of the commercial sex industry, it's very hard to get out, because that is where the biggest financial reward is. And for buyers, that's where the biggest sexual reward is as well. So when you're doing something and you're thinking it's working for you, you don't really examine the possibility that it's not, and you don't really consider changing. So my friend, who actually she's the executive director of this organization here in Edmonton, CEASE, Center to End All Sexual Exploitation. She said it so beautifully. She said, "There's many pathways in and so few pathways out." So there's a lot of things that are just, out there, and it's like the multiple heads of the hydra to the sex industry. There's porn, there's the OnlyFans, there's the strip clubs, there's all these things, and they all just suck you into the belly. And so when people say, well, we have to tackle prostitution, but pornography is okay, or we have to tackle prostitution, but strip clubs are okay, it's all one big beast, and we have to tackle sexual commodification, really, because it's detrimental to both the buyer and the seller.
It just makes me think, was there anyone looking out for you, friends or relatives?
Yeah, I hid it from basically everybody in my life for the first year and a half, which was extremely, extremely hard on my mental health. I eventually did tell my sister because I wanted to save some money, and I was actually very scared that I might get robbed or followed home and stalked because I'm leaving the same location every single day with, large sums of cash money. And so our bylaw here in Edmonton says that brothels, body rub centers have to close at 11 p.m. So there would be, at times 4 or 5 of us leaving that site at 11 p.m. and all other businesses around have closed. We all have, between $500 and $1,500 cash on us. We're all young women. And, we'd get followed home. We'd have men circling the lot or parking away, spying on us basically. And very, very scary stuff. So I actually asked my sister, can I put a little safe at your house and I'll just put some money there? And, that way I can pay my tuition and do all these things and not worry about losing it should something happen and I get my house invaded or something terrible. And so she was actually very worried about me and told my parents. And that was kind of where it all came to light. Once it was out, then it was very sad because I could see that it hurt my parents, but I also know that they trusted that I was doing what I felt I had to do and that what I thought at the time was the best decision for me. So it was always kind of like this big elephant in the room that we didn't talk about after it came to light. And that was also very hard too, because it created a very big disconnect in my family unit with the people that I love. And it made them feel very uncomfortable. Like, we all know what's going on, but we can't really talk about it. It was very, very challenging. And even once I exited, I was not very public about my past until 7 years after I exited. So I've only been fully public with my legal name and my face since June of 2020. That's when I ripped the Band-Aid off and said, I'm going all in. There's no going back. So that's actually been an improvement.
So why did you come out?
A couple reasons. So, a couple weeks after I exited the industry, I started speaking to Edmonton Police Service recruits and trying to create awareness within them about the slippery slope and about the constrained choice of women in so called sex work and how it isn't this neatly compartmentalized industry of sex work or trafficking and nothing else. And I also started speaking at the Edmonton Sex Trade Offender Program, which is loosely known as a John School, which helps to educate men and try to help them connect to resources for their own healing. And so I was doing a lot of this work. And I was also doing some media interviews, but I would always have them blur my face. I would always give an alias. I had had 3 children very soon with my husband after exiting the industry. And so I was very worried about the impact on them and the impact on, my parents and everybody else about me going public. I had still a lot of shame within me. What I found was that it was really just reproducing the dissociation and the double identity that I had lived with for the 7 years that I was in prostitution. And I was finding that incredibly traumatic, where I just felt like I was hiding again and not being my true, authentic self. And I also found that my activism was not very effective because I was a nameless, faceless person just speaking, on this blurred video or writing in this article where there was no human connection with the person receiving that information. So I spoke with my husband and just said, I can't keep doing this. I want to keep doing the work, but I need to do it the way that I need to do it. And he was very supportive, and the rest is history.
That's amazing. I have to say, it is very hard to say things when you think your children are going to hear those stories, but you have such a powerful story. And I think, even for myself, telling my children that I was sexually assaulted it was very challenging, because that was the whole reason I started doing what I do, and honestly, that's like we said earlier, the wound is where the light enters, that's what's helping you to help other people. And I think ultimately, not even ultimately, I think initially and ultimately your children are going to be nothing but proud, you know what I mean? Because it's such a understandable, it's such a unfortunately common story, and there aren't a lot of people who are brave enough to do the work that it takes to put their face out there and to do work, to speak in front of parliament and do all of the things that you're doing. So I'm sure they are going to be nothing but proud of you your whole life. So
Thank
just
you.
as an
That means a
aside.
lot.
Yeah,
Thank you
of
so much.
course. Of course. I think it's interesting what you said about how we were talking about the slippery slope, and that, people get a little bit more feel a little bit more comfortable. Like, I start watch by watching porn. I then have a little bit more courage to do something a little bit more that would have been scary before, that's a little bit more deviant or whatever, or seeking out sex workers. It's like an escalation of comfortability and then diving in deeper. But I thought what you said was really interesting, because you said it's really hard the deeper you get into sex work as the sex worker. The deeper you get in, the harder it is to get out. And if nothing speaks to the disparity between the buyer and the seller, that should be it. The seller is left with a stigma, a reputation, something to be embarrassed about, a big hole in their resume where they weren't working for 5 years and trying to explain that, dealing with all of the trauma that's left behind like you poignantly spoke about in your essay, that there's the trauma of having been a sex worker and all of the violence and degradation that accompanies that, where the buyer can walk away relatively unknown. Unless they get caught, they can walk away relatively unknown. The sex worker is so much harder for, and that speaks to a power imbalance if nothing else does.
Yeah, and that always comes back around to that social presentation of the industry, because again, we all know that men do have consciences, that they do care, they have empathy, they are capable of those things, but we cannot show that side because that hurts the money machine. So, patriarchy is real. I know people will say, "Oh, it's not. There's no patriarchy," but there is. There is that social conditioning that impacts men. Men are victims of patriarchy as well. Although they benefit from it, they also are harmed by it. So I really have a hard time when people say, like, "You're too soft on the buyers," and, throw these men in jail forever. I have learned in 10 years of being a presenter at our John School that when you give men the information and when it's honest and it's delivered, on the cold hard platter, they are receptive to it. And a lot of times I've heard them say, "I had no clue. She told me that she liked it. She was smiling and happy throughout the whole thing. So how would I have known any differently?" And I always say, well, that's the thing. There is absolutely no way for a buyer to discern with certainty that a woman is there because she actually enjoys having sex with strangers for money. So I think, that's something important to keep in mind too, is that yes, there undoubtedly is a subset of sex sellers that do enjoy selling sex, that, want to be in the sex trade because it works well with their schedule or it gives them that financial freedom. But how does the buyer discern who those people are? Because even the trafficked woman has to say, "I choose this job. I'm happy in this job. It's work, work, work," all the labor euphemisms. Because if we say anything else, we will be ostracized within the community because we've broken that facade, the lie, and buyers will not come, so we will not make money. And for the women who are exploited and trafficked by pimps, they will face repercussions for the loss of income for that exploiter. So we just have to remember that we cannot find a way to safely regulate the sex trade because it's an innate human activity that is about intimacy and connection and vulnerability and trust and mutuality and all those things. So yes, some women who choose the sex industry might be upset about it, but we have to really look at what is good for women as a whole rather than a tiny subset of privileged women that are benefiting.
I have to ask you about that. I always think that that number is incredibly small, but the fact that you're talking about it and that there is that subset, like, would you say like this is what I have seen from, and again, I mostly have spoken to porn stars, girls who have left the porn industry. And I will tell you that 100% of them have a lot of times no idea what trafficking is. They don't understand what trafficking is. Not understanding what trafficking is makes it very hard to self identify as a trafficked individual. And once they understand what it means to be trafficked, they are like, oh, and it's like a download of information, like of understanding of all of the moments in their life that led to this, or not in their life, but in like the recent years that led to this being in control or having been forced, fraud, or coercion in order to commercially sell sex. I find it interesting that there is this subset that you speak of. So, do you think that there is a lack of knowledge on the part of sex workers about what it means to be trafficked? And if people understood that, would you still think that there was, like, what percentage of people would you say actively decide, I'm going to enter this work. I'm going to have sex with somebody who might beat the shit out of me, who might, force me to do something on film, who might, if I'm a prostitute, film me doing the work that I'm doing without my no knowledge. What percentage would you say are actually understanding what trafficking is and saying, yes, this is work I choose to do?
That's always tough. Yeah. And that's always kind of the question because we like numbers, right? We like to have stats that can say, okay, this is the facts and this is what we know and this is how we can respond given those facts. But it's very, very challenging because it's a very transient community. Women also go through what I call the revolving door, where they go in and out and in and out because there's so many repeated attempts to break away and rejoin mainstream society that a lot of times it's just very, very tough to kind of paint the picture of what is really going on.
Mhm.
And then again, of course, stigma makes it very hard for us to connect with that population and the secrecy of it all. So there's absolutely women who are aware of what trafficking is, who are very, very educated on the topic of commercial sex, who still self-identify as sex workers. And I think a lot of those women really have aligned with liberal feminist ideology that says basically choice feminist narratives that tell you if you choose to do it, it is naturally a feminist act. It is naturally empowering because you as the woman have chosen that for yourself, right? The whole kind of my body, my choice co-opting, if you will. But I think there's also a lot of sensationalization whenever we talk about trafficking in the public sphere. So, for me, whenever I was in the sex industry, trafficking wasn't really a very common term yet at that point. It was more so pimping. That was what we knew. And I knew women who were pimped and I did operate alongside several of them, as well as a woman who meets the criteria of trafficking, which is not necessarily exactly the same as pimping. But we didn't really understand it at that time. She had a manager, right? Or she had a boyfriend who was helping her with things. So there was always this kind of a lot of reframing of stuff. And it wasn't really the honest facts. But they estimate, there's a whole bunch of different studies, but they estimate that it's between 25 million and 40 million people globally who are trafficked every single year. And the majority of those trafficking victims are for labor purposes, but a very, very large portion of trafficking victims are for sexual exploitation. And most of those people are women and children. Well, I should say that I'm not a trafficking specialist, having not been trafficked. So my definition and my understanding might not be the exact one. So I would encourage people to source out more accurate sources for that. But pimping essentially is just, the leech. It's the man who just leeches off of you. Whereas trafficking was much more, as per my understanding, again, as a more strategized action of movement and maybe Stephanie, you might actually know more about this than I would about the actual definition of trafficking because that's not my realm, but it's much more, action, means, and purpose of finding somebody and luring them through that system. And then, like a pimp, I don't know. I'm going to pass it off to you, Stephanie, because I'm just going to
Yeah,
ramble and I'm probably not going to give the perfect definitions.
yeah,
So,
you actually don't. Trafficking makes it sound like you have to move from one place to another. Trafficking can happen on your computer. You can literally be like we were talking about, a kid could be gaming and someone could come through their gaming console, like the software, and say, "Hey, let's move over to this other platform." They get on that other platform and they're like, "Send me a picture of such and such." They send them a picture of their foot. They pay them $5. They're like, "Hey, if you send me a picture of your boob, I'll pay you $25." So it's like a grooming that happens, and basically it's a commercial sex act that happens because of force, fraud, or coercion. It has nothing to do with the movement of people, though a lot of times we take that and think, oh, because of the term trafficking, that it's, and because a lot of them have come from other countries, we feel like that happens. That's actually the sad misunderstanding, because it can happen, and that's why a lot of people don't identify. Just as a small story to illustrate it, I had a woman who was married to a man who they together sort of consented to be an open marriage. He started taking pictures of her and selling them to the people that they were swinging with. That then turned into that is actually trafficking. He used her pictures unbeknownst to her, sold them to this couple. So it can happen in your own home, it can happen through the computer, it can happen out on the street, it can happen moving from one country to another. It's very much so the commodification of a sex act or thing, that is taken from an individual in a vulnerable position through force, fraud, or coercion.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for clarifying, because I know the terminology is quite actually distinct. And I always find there's a lot of blending together of the pimping component and the trafficking component. And I'm always just very careful with that, because I do know that I've had friends that have been under a pimp, but they say I've not met the criteria of trafficking. He was just essentially a deadbeat that was just kind of living off of me and taking my money. So, living off the avails or the material benefit, but it wasn't exactly trafficking. So I know a lot of people try to ask me to clarify, and I'm sorry I couldn't do that very well, because it's not my area of specialty. And I still struggle with kind of understanding and pulling apart trafficking, because it is a newer conversation and it's a complex conversation as well.
It definitely is complex, but maybe let's walk through it. I mean, when you look at your situation, do you consider yourself trafficked?
Well, and see, and I don't even consider that trafficking personally, because really the nature of it, like, and again, that's debatable. Some people will say owning a brothel is absolutely trafficking because you're profiting off someone. But was there force, fraud, or coercion? I mean, there was coercion to some degree, in that she had posted ads in a newspaper that I saw whenever I was economically destitute, and I responded to it. But was that really coercion, or was it an ad kind of thrown out there to like be fishing basically and say, hey, anyone poor, come on in? So I think to some degree, trafficking has to have that more intimate connection with people rather than commercial sex on its own. It's much more of a deeper interpersonal offense, I think, than just the existence of the commercial sex industry. So I have had people try to say, no, you were trafficked. And I always try to say, no, no, I was not. I don't identify as a survivor. I was not pimped. I was not trafficked, but I was victimized by the machine, the commercial sex industry. So yeah, and that's
I would
really,
agree with you by what you've said. Like, it's one thing if like you were working at the brothel and she forced you to do the acts that you did, that would probably qualify. But if it was you taking work because of, I mean, and again, I'm not an expert. I happen to know more because I've been on panels and discussed it, but you could be right that there's maybe a little bit of a distinction between what happened for you. So
Mhm.
that is interesting to talk about, because the pimp does exert some power, and so that is it is kind of a different thing. It's like the force to do it is different than just taking money. But here's the thing is, again, if the pimp were controlling something for you, like if you had a drug habit or you needed anything, condoms, medicine, a place to live, a place to use, that would, you would be forced to, do something in order to get what your need, to have your vulnerability needs met. food,
Mhm.
drugs, whatever that happens to be.
Yeah, and there's so many gray areas in these distinctions, and that's why I really struggle with it a lot of the time because the madam that I did operate under, the very first one, she knew that I was brand new. She knew that I was, deeply, deeply in debt, $60,000 in debt. And when a man would come to the door, I was the new girl and I was the young girl. So I was extremely in demand and popular right off the get go. And she would pressure me to go into that room. She would say, "He wants to stay with you." And I'd say, "I don't really feel comfortable staying with him. Like he's really giving me a bad vibe." And she'd say, "Well, if you don't stay with him, I don't have a shift for you. I'm not hiring people to sit on the couch and not make me money." So some people would say, "Well, that is
I would say
trafficking," or
that's
that is,
trafficking.
yeah, but again, by my understanding and my feeling of how I resonate with that, it's never really been something that I think it is. But maybe again, that goes back to what you said, where a lot of women
That they
don't
don't
identify with that.
self-identify.
And yeah, so I think that there, no matter what we call it, that there is always some degree of coercion that occurs or insistence. But I don't even honestly know if it's always malicious, because I think that women get so deeply embedded in the industry. We climb the corporate ladder, as we want to call it. Just like myself, we go on to build a brothel thinking that's the solution. That's how we're all going to have our autonomy. That's how we're all going to be safe and it's going to be great. And then naturally, because we are so desensitized and we are so used to selling our own sex, we see it just as a very, very harmless, normal activity. So then, whenever a new, younger woman comes in who has not yet been captured so deeply by the ideology, we naturally have this way of denouncing their pain, being very dismissive of any fears that they have, and just kind of saying, "What's a big deal? Go in there. We're here to make money. This is our job. Go to work." And, I tried to be very aware of that whenever I operated and owned a brothel, because I didn't want to treat women how I was treated whenever I first entered the industry, which really made me feel like I was just an object for sale. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm just as bad for and just as guilty for owning a brothel and contributing to the machine and the system. But, I always tried to have empathy for women in understanding that, I knew a lot of us didn't want to be there. It was, worst case scenario for a lot of us in our lives.
So, did that influence you to decide to get out of the industry?
Oh, it was so many little events. So I know that a lot of times there's a catalyst, and some research, the very little bit of research that has been done on it has on women exiting has found that it's typically a positive catalyst. So a job opportunity or a pregnancy or a healthy relationship that gets women to exit, or it's a negative catalyst. So an accumulation of violence, a very, very bad sexual assault of some type, an incident of being outed and discovered for what we're doing. So there's usually one kind of big, like, boom moment for a lot of women, but there's also for a lot of women just these little, erosion moments. And I think for me that was the case, was just the crumbling of the house of cards, if you will. So it was seeing my impact on other women, both inside the industry and outside the industry, with my endorsement of sex work ideology and my existence of having a brothel. It was seeing what I was doing to the men, seeing that I was lying to them, that I was emotionally manipulating them in their own sadness and their own loneliness and vulnerabilities. It was, recognizing the social impact of the hypersexualized culture and how that had impacted me and kind of groomed me to believe that, it was my choice and I wanted to be there to some measure. And it was also, yeah, just I think education, formal education in just understanding commercial sex as coercion and as a form of violence against women, and also recognizing dissociation and all those mental challenges and trauma and stuff, because I had been so deeply dissociated for so many years and really operated on autopilot. And then just one day it was like, "Oh, that's dissociation. Oh, I think I've been doing that. Oh my gosh, now I can't do it anymore. Now I've snapped out." And then it was really being present in the moment, and the trauma that ensued in the last 2 years of me being in the sex trade was the absolute worst once I didn't have those protectionary means anymore.
Andrea, you spoke about the John School and educating men. And I want to say that, obviously I'm approaching this as somebody who is talking to high school and college young men and women, right? And so for me, this is a really important conversation because it demystifies what happens to sex workers. And, I maybe we covered a lot of it, but maybe I think it's important just to say, what is it like? What is the reality of being a sex worker? That they are, under false pretenses of what that means. But before you get into that, I just want to say, as an educator of college men in particular, and my own son, who's now in college, but I had been starting to talk to his friends and him long ago about all of these things. Obviously, like I said, my first interest was pornography and the girls who were in porn and all that kind of stuff. But when I talk to young men, they always come up to me afterward and they say, "Why didn't you tell us at the beginning of this class to not watch porn? Why didn't you tell us, like, wasn't that like what you started with?" Because once they learn what a porn actor goes through, the lies that they're told, the degradation, the humiliation, the absolute violence, and the, rape that happens literally on camera, the the number of people who have videos posted of them where they were not aware, they did not agree. I know that in your story that happened to you. Once they realize all of that, they're like, what the hell? This is not what I've been believing. So I always say, the boys in my class write the best letters to me. They write the best responses. They're the first ones to come up because they are like, I have been living in a matrix that someone, lied to me all of these years. And I know from talking to the porn actresses that they're told, you go to these porn conferences, you have to say how much you love sex, you love this. It's the sales pitch, the sales pitch. And of course it feels good. They want to believe this stuff, but once they understand, that is life changing. I really believe so many of my students have been like, I tell now everybody, they're in fraternities, they're telling their brothers, it's like, these are people that you're like in the prime of their sex life and want to watch pornography and do all that stuff. And they are sharing the message. So education is the greatest thing. And men are the key to the success of this. And they are interested and very open to it and very sad that they have been lied to.
The first line of your essay is quite sobering. I carry over 4,300 emotional scars with me every day from each man I sold my body to during 7 years of prostitution.
I'm gonna link that in the podcast so that people can read that, because I read it to my husband. I cried both times I read it. I cried.
Thank you. Honestly, I try to share that as much as possible because I think it's short enough that people will read it, but it's really kind of reflective of the presentation that I give at the John School, where it just shows like how it's hit after hit after hit, and it's this compounding effect that women are under, where it's not just like one day we oftentimes wake up and just say, "Oh, I think I'm going to do this." Like it's a slow unraveling of our life as we know it, which then starts into this slow creation of a new life, which is really quite harmful. And we think it's the answer to what we're struggling with, but it's not. It's actually, an outcome of the problems that we've had. And it's a replication of those problems and an increase in those problems too. So it means a lot to me to have you share that. Thank you so much. That piece was actually first published by Caroline Norma and Melinda Tankard-Reist out of Australia in their book, Prostitution Narratives, Stories of Survival in the Sex Trade. And that book was published, I want to say in 2015. So yeah, a wonderful book that I can't recommend enough. It really kind of rocked and shook the world whenever it came out. And there's a ton of really good, well, I shouldn't say really good, but really moving firsthand accounts from several women. And so I recommend that book to everybody. So my story is actually under Kendra in there because that was still whenever I was going under my old alias that I had in the sex trade and not ready yet to use my name. So my story is Epiphany by Kendra in there, my old name. So, but it's been republished since, and I've shared it a few times, and I always find it's quite impactful. So thank you. And I'm sorry, I've been talking. I completely forgot what your overall question was.
I was just going to say, you know what, actually,
Oh, that's
you
right.
teach at John School. So why don't you tell us what you tell them, that you feel is impactful to those to the buyers?
Well, I think I go in there and I'm fortunate in that I co-present alongside another woman who spent many, many years as an Indigenous woman on the streets, 25 years in the industry with very severe addiction, history of familial trafficking, childhood sexual abuse by a pedophile, sorry. And so she goes up first and she gives, the most horrific account of what someone can experience in prostitution, and it leaves men in tears. They're sitting there the whole time with their mouth just covered, trying to keep their composure because, like many stories, it's just hit after hit after hit. And very, very traumatic, even for me to hear her story 10 years later. Every time I hear it, it goes right into my core. So men will hear that story and they'll think, that's not me. I would never be the guy who's trolling on the streets and picking up a visibly underage child and sexually exploiting them. I would never do that. I go to the sex workers. I go to the women who choose it. I just go through the internet. I make sure the women I see are mid-20s, so that they're not a minor. I'm not part of the problem. And that speaks again back to that compartmentalizing that so many people operate in whenever they're trying to justify their involvement in this industry, either as a buyer or a seller. And so after she gives her very heartfelt account of her life, I go up and I say, okay, you've heard that and you are now thinking that's not me. Well, let's talk about the women that you see in the hotels and the women that you see in the brothels. And so I kind of just then lead them through my story about, again, the slow entry into the industry based on debt, based on abusive relationships, based on hyper-sexualized culture. And I always just try to bring it back around to them understanding, and really pulling apart this concept of choice versus a decision, because there's a very, very big difference between the two. And so people will always say to me, you chose the industry, you chose it. And I say, no, I decided to enter the industry because I had no choice. So very clear distinction to that. And then whenever I just talk about like the numbness, that I find is very impactful for them too, because when they hear her account that is so sensationalized with all these horrific things happening, and then whenever I come in and talk about, being very, very privileged in the industry, being a Caucasian woman, starting at the top brothel in my city right from the get-go, always charging hundreds of dollars an hour, having, more safety to some degree than those on the streets and things like that. But then I talk about the deadening of me on the inside. So saying, okay, women on the street, yes, they are very much at high risk of instant death, of murder. But what about us inside? We literally lay on our backs on a bed as strange man after strange man after strange man takes his turn with us. And if that, doesn't make you think of just how much it turns us into what my friend calls mince meat, it really, then you, in my opinion, you don't have empathy, you don't have a soul, because when you're just laying there and it's one man after another till the point that, like you said, citing 4,300 men in that article that I wrote, you can't look at it as anything other than just sexual abuse, because obviously you're not desiring all those people. So it's just basically having a machine spit you up or chew you up and spit you out, and that's exactly what the sex industry does. So it's not the immediate death, but it's the slow death to the point that you're nothing. And one thing I find really helps with them particularly is saying, every single man that had sex with me took a tiny little piece of me, because there was that human connection that we made, that intimate connection that should be intimate, I should say. He took a piece of me and he put a little piece of him in that space that he left. So we end up being this mosaic, if you will, of all the abuse, all that dark energy, all that trauma, all that misogyny, all the horrific things that happen in the industry, that gets put into us and into our entity, our spirit. And at the end of it, it's really not shocking that so many women die by suicide and develop drug addiction and all those things, because we are just so numb. And when we do feel something, it is trauma. So that's just kind of where I try to reach them. And then, of course, I try to get them to look inward and say, you deserve better as well, too. Like, you're not there, for any good reason. You're there because you are sad. You are there because you're lonely, because you feel inept in your ability to connect with other humans. And why is that? Did you have low self-esteem? Did you experience childhood abuse? And oftentimes we found that upwards of half of the men that come through our program have had childhood sexual traumas and just childhood trauma in general by doing the ACEs test on them. So it's important that we have to heal men because it's really hurt people that are hurting people. They're not healthy men.
Miseducated and hurting individuals that seek out sex work. And I think I don't know if you would say this, but I know that it has a lot to do with like intimacy disorders, people who are addicted to sex, right? Like I think that's like one of the things is it's just, people who are missing that intimate connection in their life, whether it was when they were young and in their, formative years or later on in their life. It's like there's something missing. So I think that's really important that you have people look at themselves. Sex work is, unfortunately, the culture is not setting us up for healthy outcomes, I think, in any way, from young people who see, that they have to objectify themselves in order to have recognition, and or the fact that there's so few opportunities for women, especially of certain backgrounds, demographics, to make enough money to survive, for survival. I mean, we're talking about the problem, but one of the underlying, if you go like upstream, is the fact that we have to have better opportunities and training in for all people, or this is unfortunately something that they may choose to do in their life, or not choose, out of desperation, end up doing, decide, as you said, decide to do.
And
Yes.
I just want to kind of build on what you said and just say, a lot of times people will then challenge me and say, well, if you empathize with these men, why do you want to see them get arrested? Just offer programs and services that will help them quit buying sex, but not arrest them, because why should they get a criminal record if women aren't, and they're just as affected by the industry. And it is very sad. It's sad to see men get arrested because it's traumatic to them to get caught up in a police sting, very much so. And of course, I don't support, criminalization of anybody to some measure, because it's very detrimental to your life as a whole. But study after study that has looked at it has found that fear of arrest and actually being arrested is the main catalyst that will help men to stop buying sex. And so, just as the women have that catalyst that kind of breaks them out of it and tips them over the edge, that's oftentimes the tipping point of the men as well, because being arrested comes with fear of exposure in their, romantic relationships, or possibly an upset in their employment or exposure there as well. So, that's why it's so crucial that we have John Schools, because John Schools act as an alternative measures program. It gives that man that wake up call, because otherwise, what is the catalyst that will rock his world to make him stop? Possibly getting robbed or stabbed by a pimp, or, something horrendous happening to him. And so really John Schools are a gift to men, because it gives them that chance to be removed from the industry, hear the information firsthand from people who have nothing to gain in lying to them, and can give those honest accounts. And it allows men to really go within and start looking at themselves, and it gives them a second chance. Then, so long as they can take those tools and those resources and not continue to exploit women, they don't end up with a criminal record. So, there's a lot of countries that don't offer John Schools, that just do full on criminalization. And it makes me very sad, because I think men deserve that second chance. But we have to have some measure of, stopping the demand. They are driving the demand. As damaged or sad as men are, they are still, putting the gas into the car of this machine. And so we need to break that connection in some kind of way. And, so yeah, I support law enforcement in doing more operations, against men, but also I think it has to be paired with John School operations too.
So now I'm understanding. I was going to ask you first, what is John School? But it sounds like it's some part of like restorative justice.
Yeah, so it can either be a condition of probation after a charge, or it can be an alternative measures program, so a diversion program. And I'm really a supporter of it being a diversion program, because a lot of John Schools, and again, we go with what stats we have, but most of them show a very, very low recidivism rate.
Wow.
The Edmonton John School program has less than a 3% recidivism rate, which really speaks to the power of education. Like you said, Stephanie, once you know better, you do better. And a lot of the exposure that these men have had to the sex trade has just been, as was myself, just that social hyper-sexualized culture, the narrative of everything's great, everything's awesome, everyone chooses it, good times. And so, yeah, it's a very, very powerful program that brings forth police agencies to talk about, a lot of the crimes that they've seen, like robberies happening against men, the violence that the women are facing on accounts of pimping and trafficking, bringing probation in to talk about, like how this can affect your life, your ability to just travel outside the country, future employment, bringing forth survivors who have obviously endured very horrific times in the sex industry, men who have struggled with sex addiction that are part of Sex Anonymous support groups. They come and speak. We have a former buyer of 35 years who, after he was arrested and went through the John School program, he said, I want to be part of the solution, not the problem anymore. So he comes and talks about how, he was very obviously upset with being arrested, but how it was really transformative for him in his life. We do scenarios with the men. So we say, again, okay, here's this little scenario, read it. You're now, the father of this woman who this is happening to. How does that make you feel? Do you feel helpless? Kind of shifting their mindset and their
Yeah.
perspective. Yeah. So it's all very powerful.
Do you know of any educational program that's sort of just obviously, if you're the sex buyer, you need some more intensive thing like this. But I do think that, like, just hearing this stuff initially before getting into that, like, I know I do my part in my class to educate people about sex workers as much as I can, the information that I have. But are there actually documentaries or programs like, I often talk to people who have been trafficked about creating some sort of program that young girls can look at so that they don't become the victims of trafficking, and they really understand what the porn industry looks like, what sugaring looks like, all of that kind of stuff. Is there anything like that for the buyer that isn't like a restorative justice type program?
There's not enough. That's for certain. What we're seeing, which is very, very encouraging, is a lot of initiatives to target young boys, just,
Yes,
in the
that's what I was gonna
school
say.
system.
Early is
Yeah,
important.
very early. So there's a group ran by a woman here in Canada named Tiana Sharifi, and she operates an organization called Sexual Exploitation Education,
Mhm.
SEE. And they have I think they're in about 80 schools from grade 1 to 12 throughout Canada. And they're doing work to, do age appropriate education on this issue. And so really kind of trying to go upstream and, pull people out of the river before they're falling into it. And so very, very commendable work. And then we also are seeing a couple groups of men, which is super encouraging, creating programs online where they're coming together, and not only are they offering resources and everything, but they are going and creating false ads of women on escort review or escort forums, sorry, not forums, escort ad websites,
Yeah.
and posing as women, and then they're actually intercepting transactions as their would be transactions as they're happening, and
Wow.
saying to the men, hey, we're here for you. Why are you buying sex? Do you need someone to talk to? Check out our website. Here's some resources. So Epic, EPIK, they're a group out of America, and they have some locations here. They have one location here in Edmonton as well, a group doing their work. And there's also Buyer Resist. That's another group that's come out. So that's really a testament to what you said earlier about, men being really needing to be the champions in leading this fight and this pushback. So that's, I think, a good way to go about it, because everything has moved online. It's very rare that we're seeing any street exploitation happening, except for our absolute most marginalized people. Most everything now is on internet websites. So we have to go where the men are, and we don't want to have to arrest them and get it to that point. And maybe for some of them, it won't take arrest, and we can spare them that experience by just intercepting a would be transaction and offering them resources. So it's all very encouraging.
Well, I would like to say I'm going to reach out to you again, because I'm hoping that maybe even, like, I found reading to my students the letter of a girl, Sydney, who is, an ex porn star. Reading that too, the first time I read it, I was going to a frat house at Dartmouth, and I said, "Can you give me something to share with these young men that will shake them out of this false narrative of what pornography is?" And she wrote this piece for me that the same as your letter, just made me cry. And it really does. I read it in my classes. It makes all of my students go like, "Wow, I had no idea." But again, pornography and that being a trafficked thing is a little different than like what we're talking about, which I think is so easy for someone to believe in the glamour, want the money, need and be desperate, go down the slippery slope of I started by sugaring, all that kind of stuff. So I would love to reach out to you after this and maybe get something. I don't necessarily, we'll talk about it, but I think it would be really powerful because I think it's two different sides of the same thing that both stories are equally important and have different lessons to be learned for both young ladies and young guys in school.
Yeah, that'd be
I don't
great.
know. I mean, education as far upstream as you can go is the most powerful thing that we can do for people. The more people understand that the reasons they're going there are because of something that's wrong, some connection that they're not getting in their real life. The more people can recognize that, the younger, the more positive outcomes we have for everybody. And
Yeah.
the less need there is to go find and seek it from someone else who's vulnerable.
What would you tell your 20-year-old self before you entered the sex industry?
That one always gets me because I've been asked that before, like,
Yeah.
hindsight is
Yeah.
2020, right? As per
Yeah.
my Twitter handle. And truthfully, I never have an answer. I don't really know because at the end of the day, I would have entered the sex industry because of poverty regardless. I was about to lose my housing. I was deeply in debt. I really didn't have another option. So at that point, I think had I had all the information and everything that I know now,
Mhm.
maybe, just maybe, I would have understood that I could have claimed bankruptcy. And would that have changed my situation? Perhaps. But if I would have known everything I know now, I wouldn't probably have mentally survived the industry because I wouldn't have been dissociated.
Mm.
So in some ways, I kind of think I wouldn't go back and say anything to her because I think having that dissociation and that ignorance to some degree helped me to endure that experience. So
Mm.
yeah, but and I think again that goes back to we say education, education, and of course it's so important to break the myths, but education doesn't give the complete picture. And the complete picture is that we need to close the wealth gap and we need to address socioeconomic marginalization of women and economic stratification of people in general, because we're seeing the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and people will do things out of absolute desperation. And so, yeah, we have to tackle it both from an economic position and from a patriarchal position, from that social understanding too.
This is actually a legislative thing. Like there should be a place that you can go to as a young 22-year-old woman who's had all of these things that somebody put her in financial debt. She doesn't have a lot of skills. There should actually be an office. I mean, our government spends money on stuff that doesn't even matter. But this is such a huge problem. And there are so many people who are in this position that you go to this office and they give you a skill set and help you find work. I mean, I'm sure to a degree, I guess you could go to a welfare office. I don't really know. But it seems to me that it's not known to a 22-year-old. What can I do when I'm $60,000 in debt? I have been completely like my self-esteem is in the toilet because of the way people have treated me, and I don't have skills, but I desperately want to be able to become financially independent and survive.
Mhm.
It seems to me that like this should be something we educate young people about. Like, here is this office, you can go here in dire straits. These people, this government, these tax dollars will pay to get you to a place. If you're willing to commit for 6 months, they're willing to commit to help you to get some sort of training where you don't have to do that, and assistance that somebody destroyed your credit, they're helping you. That just seems
Mhm.
it just seems logical. Why? I don't know that if somebody knows that that exists, somebody should let me know. But
I know.
it's crazy that that is your freaking option.
Yeah,
I
right.
wholeheartedly agree. Like, that's what we need. We need wraparound services, right? Because again, just tackling these tiny little things is not the bigger picture. There's so many heads to the hydra of women's lives and the problems that we're facing. And yeah, like you said, we're just pouring money out into these other things. But in order for us to get to that beautiful place that you speak of, that I hope that we do get to one day, we need to first acknowledge that this is harmful to women.
Yes.
And that's where we are not there yet, because people are still, holding on to those myths and trying to operate from these places of denial that everybody is having a great time in the industry. So people always say to me, why aren't you fighting, for universal basic income? And why aren't you fighting for, all these types of things, more socialist policies and everything? And I say, well, I support all those things, of course, but we can't even get people to support those policies around prostitution if they can't recognize that prostitution is harmful.
No,
So,
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
People might want to call it like fake activism or slacktivism or anything to speak about it, but I think it takes people in all areas. We need people speaking about the myths about the issue. We need people speaking about poverty. We need people speaking out about, patriarchal impacts. It's going to take a lot of us doing a lot of the work in a lot of areas.
Yeah.
So.
Agreed. Well, that said, where can we find you if we're looking to help or to get involved or to do anything? Is there somewhere where you would direct people to reach out to you if they wanted to do anything to help?
Well, I keep on saying, I'm going to create a website. I'm going to create a website. And I've just been so incredibly busy, not only with my children and my family, but just with this film and this book for the last 3 years. It's taken so much of my time and my education and everything. So I keep on promising this website, and maybe someday someone will help me do that and take it off my plate. And then I'll actually have kind of a ground zero or a home base that people can find me at. But as for now, it's basically just Twitter, which is not really my ideal place, because as you know, Twitter is a dumpster fire, toxic place at times when you're in this conversation. Sure, it has lots of good pockets to it, but this isn't one of it. And so it's a very volatile, angry place. And I oftentimes have to just step back from Twitter and take a break, because it just really wears on my mental health sometimes too. So that's where I can be found for now. My email also, if you Google my name and find my scholarly papers, it has my email. So I'm always available for direct contact. I'm always open to collaborating. So that's how to find me for now. And then hopefully
Twitter
one day.
handle? What's your Twitter?
So it's my last name, Heinz, Heinz, Heinz Site 2020. So Heinz Site 2020.
I love it. It's literally the best name ever.
This is my one witty moment there. I was like, oh, it's pretty good.
Well, I'm actually so glad, knowing how hard it is to get a hold of you, that I actually found a way to get a hold of you, because the second I saw you speaking for the Nordic model, I was like, okay, I love her. So I'm so grateful that we had this opportunity.
Yeah. And I know that you and I did a lot of back and forth trying to make this happen. And it was like, okay, can't do it now. We'll do it later. Can't do it now. Do it later. Thanks for your patience and everything. So, thank you for keeping on top of it. It was. I'm very glad to connect with you. It's always great to know people doing the good work. So I again, have much respect for you and appreciate all that you're doing.
You too.
Thank you.
Care. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of 7 on Sundays.
The 7 on Sundays podcast represents the opinions of Dr. Shez Libby and Stephanie Boye based on our experience. It also shares the stories, behaviors, and opinions of our guests that we do not necessarily condone or view as healthy. 7 on Sundays is an open forum to discuss what is happening with our listening audience. Some names and details of our guest stories have been changed to protect their anonymity. This podcast is not a substitute for mental health treatment. If you are in crisis and in need of mental health support, please call 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. It is free and confidential.
Join the conversation and connect with us through our website, 7onsundays.com. That's the number 7 on Sundays.com. We encourage everyone to do their own research. Thank you and be well.